Rohit, Rohit, are you saying something?
Chup, chup, chup. I'm sorry, sir. I was speaking to someone else.
Okay.
I didn't know my mic was on, so I was speaking to someone else.
All right. So, good afternoon, everybody. So, we will start where we left off yesterday. Can some of you tell me what you were discussing yesterday? Can you recall? I hope you are able to see the slides. Can you see the slides?
Yes, sir.
All right. So yesterday we were talking about limits to the market economic system, and in that we basically talked about two things. One was monopoly power, then second was externalities. And so today we will cover the another remaining two, that is the collective consumption goods, that is public goods, So this is another source of inefficiencies for laissez-faire equilibrium. And why it is an inefficiency? Because of the fact that the public goods, they are characterized by non-excludability of consumptions and non-depletability of consumptions in terms of uh, non-rival in consumptions and uh, non-excludability. Okay. So, so you may have already studied in public finance the nature of public goods and how it makes the market inefficient, right? So, what exactly you mean by non-excludability? What is it? Or rather non-rival. Can you give an example of non-rivalness of the consumption? Do you have something in mind that represents this kind of good, economic good?
So any software?
Sorry, software. Software is
Yes,
non.
sir.
Yes, okay. Software is good example of non-rival. But is it non-excludable?
No, sir, it is excludable.
Then what kind of good is this? Non-excludability is there. Non-excludability is difficult, but non-rival in consumption. So what sort of good is it? What is it called?
I,
Have you
I
heard
don't
about
remember the names.
in public finance? You may have heard about club good. No, club good. Then you have the common pool resources. And public good and private good. There are basically four kinds of goods are available in our economy. One is the pure private good, like any other things that you see in your possession. These are all pure private goods. Your car, your house, your pen, pencil, dress, everything that your food, all are pure private good. Where excludability is is there. Excludable. You can exclude others. You can also consumption is also rival. When you are using, others are not able to get their chance to use this, isn't it? But when excludability is you know you can exclude somebody, that means excludability is available but then is there, but consumption is not rival. So in a non-rival consumptions. So for example, this class, okay, so when I speak, right, all of you are able to get equal amount of, so there is no rivalry between you and your friends hearing what I'm saying. That's a non-rival in consumption, what we call non-depletability of consumption, and that's called club good. There are plenty of examples in our economy, so where these kind of goods are available. Now, my question is that how does this kind of goods create inefficiency in the market? Can you visualize? Can some of you tell me why the presence of such goods create inefficiency or generate inefficiency in the economy?
So we can move to a more Pareto optimal point if the good is if the non-excludability is removed from the good.
Okay.
Ex-
If the
Yeah. So
non-excludability is removed, okay. No. I'm saying that in many cases you cannot actually remove this non-excludability. Okay. Uh, and so, for example, a pond in a village. Okay, this is a common pool resources for the entire community, and you cannot exclude the households of that particular village, because everybody has a stake there. Okay, and but the consumption is rival there. There is no non-rivality or consumption there, because if one household catches fish, then other households will not get the fish. So the consumptions of pond in that case is a rivalry there. So that is another set of question. The exclusion is not possible, but the consumption rivalry is there. That's called common pool resources, isn't it? And such
I
kind
was talking about the software and the example that you give that of the current class. I was talking about that. If we remove excludability, we can move to a more optimal point.
Yeah, I mean, see, that is what I'm saying now. It's software and the village pond. They are like their characteristics quite different, isn't it? And
Yes, sir.
yes, so yeah, these are two examples. There are plenty of n number of how many goods are available which are in falling into this category of goods, and so we have to have this thing. It's not that we always market laissez-faire equilibrium, that is the market equilibrium, basically in the first place assume that all goods are owned by private individuals, isn't it? That basically assume that the exclusivity is there and rivalry in consumption is also there. That is when the market will be inefficient. It will move to a Pareto optimality condition, right? But in many cases, in many economy are also having all kinds of these kinds of commodities where common pool resources are there, club goods are there, and pure private public goods are there. So in case of pure public goods, both the conditions are violated of the private good. That is, the exclusion is very, very difficult and non-rival in consumption. And for example, the classical example that you may have heard in your public finance is the defense, national defense. Okay. Once it is provided, you cannot exclude anybody else to getting the benefits of that national defense. That means the security, the protection. So everybody gets equally, whether this is Ambani or Riksha Puller, everybody gets equal amount of protection from the external aggression. So this is one sort of, it's a pure public good, right? Similarly, we have this club good, and you have this common pool resources. And if these kind of goods are available, then the essential problems for private market provisions of true collective consumption good is the free rider problem. Because if it is once it is provided, right, then you don't want to contribute for that, because you can easily free ride, and that basically that the system facilitated that, and that's a typical problem that makes the market inefficient. And so we have these all kinds of environmental resources like biodiversity, natural resources are also falling on that category. And even the technological innovations, right? That once a company innovates a thing, after a few years, just the technical know-how is diffuses, and the other company just they just do reverse engineering and all kinds of things, and modify it, and then the advantage is gone away. So that's basically is a typical problem of free riding problems. Okay. Of course, we have the IP and intellectual property law. All kinds of things are there to preserve this exclusivity. But still, then there are weaknesses in that, isn't it? And so that is the typical problems that we see if the economies are having these kind of problems. So one of the criticisms of this kind of views comes from the radical versions of the what we call the philosophical perspective known as methodological individualism. So here methodological individualism basically saying that the thing that the individuals, it's all individual centric. It's not a collective centric, and therefore, the concept of having public good is, is something that is, not in a good perspective, because it is all about individuals, and individuals should be allowed, and they should, be operate as per their interest, not the collective interests, and so on and so forth. Now, there are basically, between these extremes of pure private goods, such as the food, or pure public goods, such as the basic law and order situations. So there is a wide spectrum of intermediate goods that have both private as well as collective aspects. And so here basically, the educations, for example, provided by a mix of both private and public sources. See, the public is more prominent at lower educational level, like the primary and levels. All the primary schools are mostly, provided by the public sector, whereas the higher educations are, are dominated by the private sector. Private sector. Now that's a kind of thing that we could see in our economy, and so the public choice school, right, which observes that the decisions regarding private versus public ownerships are made by legislative bodies at any level of government, and these bodies are subject to complexities of majority rule, and they are all lobbying by special interest groups, sheer inertia, and which basically suggests that they are all ill-suited to efficient decision making regarding the proper balance between private versus public sector. And so these are, even though there is a case for public provisions of collective consumption goods, the public choice school basically sees the public sector as so inefficient and corrupt that generally privatization is the preferred market solutions. So that's it. It's basically, there are plenty of research that exists, which basically suggests that provisions of public goods is not always an efficient one, because of the fact that the individuals, consumers, who do not contribute, or who basically try to hide, or try to not to contribute towards that, and without contributing also, they can get benefit whatever the other persons are getting. So there is always this disincentive on the part of the individual consumers to to not to contribute, and so that's why it causes inefficiency in the system. So that's why the role of government is very important, and so here again the inefficiency, market inefficiency, is this that of all the assumptions needed for the efficiency of an equilibrium outcome, is one of them is that perfect informations, and that's also a realistic one, where everything is not, there is no perfect informations anywhere about anything in this, in the real world. And so there's a special problems arise when one party in a transactions knows more than another, and this is basically, in institutional economics is known as asymmetric information. And so So asymmetric information is something that is was first prominently written by George Akerlof, who analyzed the used car market in Calcutta. So he spent a couple of months in Calcutta and tried to understand the selling and buying of old car. So in which he found that there is a asymmetry of information between the owner of the used car, who knows its flaws, and the potential customer who doesn't. But the potential customer understands this disparity, and there is therefore is suspicions of all used cars, suspecting them to be lemons their owners wish to dispose of. And so there exists an inefficiencies for anyone who seeks to sell a used car that is not lemon at a decent price. So that's a typical problem that Akerlof observed in Calcutta, and that's why it's a lemon market is a famous article that he has written, and he got Nobel Prize for that. So such asymmetries are rife in market economies. So in contractual relationships, this is also known as the principalization problems, in which someone is hired who doesn't do what is best for the employer because of his ability to mislead the ignorant employer. And so there are a lot of these principalization problems that exist in our society and in our economy. And so those examples can be easily found out. For example, the relationship between people and bureaucracy, okay, and politicians. Example, I mean, we have seen that how they are supposed to, so people are basically principals because the people elect the politicians, isn't it? Every 5 years, especially in our democratic settings. So we get chance every 5 years to elect the politicians who we think that will fulfill our promise, or the manifesto that they give us before the elections, and we choose best out of those politicians who may fulfill our all objectives. Okay, but once they elect, of course, they have to deliver those promises that they have made before to people. And so what happens is that they do not directly deliver those promises to people, but they assign to bureaucrats to do the same. So therefore bureaucrats who enjoys job permanency and other security through the constitutions, and they hold a lot of information about the ground realities, okay, how things can be executed, etc., and informations from the ground, especially the people, what they want, etc. So they basically stand in between the politicians and the people. Okay, so here's a catch that the politicians delegate their responsibility to the bureaucrats, and the bureaucrats, who cannot be dismissed, who cannot be who are less accountable to people directly, so they take the center stage, and then they try to implement and things, and in that process there is a agent and the principals, and the agents has more information than the principal, and how things can be done, etc. And all of that basically becomes very complicated, and that is why the information gap is quite wider, and therefore so bureaucrats are not accountable to people, the politicians are accountable to people, etc. And that is when this whole chain of principal agent problems comes in here. Okay, So therefore, the principalization problem, also what we call the adverse selection problem and the moral hazard problems, in a typical case where, suppose an employer hired a employee, right, to do certain jobs, and the employee has certain skills, but what is the guarantee that the employee will give 100% of what he has? So that is where actually the moral hazard problem comes. Suppose you go to a doctor and to get your things treated, and what is the guarantee that the doctor will treat you well or give you the honest or full information about the disease, about everything else? Or if you're going to a court, or if you don't know, to fight a case, for example, or you hire a attorney or a lawyer, so what is the guarantee the lawyer will give his best or guide you to the best possible outcome? So all of that actually comes into this kind of problems, what we call the principal agent problems. This is a typical problem in the service sector, isn't it? In every economy. And so that is basically, see the typical problem that what we call principal agent problem. Now, there are such information asymmetries can lead to sub-optimizing behavior because of what I said, moral hazard problems. Especially it's seen quite largely in insurance industries, in that those most needing insurance will seek it out and will conceal their need from the insurers, thereby raising rates for those who need insurance less. So that is again a typical problem of moral hazard. And those who are insured then may behave more carelessly, saying that okay, you have the insurance, so therefore you don't care about your disease, etc., and then you live a reckless life. And so that's what the moral hazard issues comes in here, both adverse selections as well as the moral hazard problem. So there is no easy way. Yes.
Sir, can you like I didn't understand the previous point properly, like
Tell
the
me.
moral hazard point.
Okay,
So like
moral hazard problem is basically, now let's first look at the other one is adverse selections, another is moral hazard. Okay, one is the ex ante problem. This adverse selection is an ex ante problem in the sense that the insurance company, they face very difficult task to segregate the insurers who are very vulnerable to different diseases, because if somebody has all kinds of diseases and he's buying an insurance, so the insurance company has to pay a lot, and the rate will increase if they continuously use that. For others who are less infected or less diseased, that's a ex ante problem of uh, while choosing a thing. But moral hazard is the ex post problem. Now once a contract is signed, or the insurers are actually, or you have the insurance, your moral hazard is basically you live a very reckless life, isn't it? And you do not care about, because of the fact that you have the insurance. So therefore, if compared to uninsured, if though I mean, if you had no insurance, the way you would have behaved, you would behave differently if you had insurance, right? That's the moral hazard problems. The other examples of moral hazard problems are basically seen, especially like if you're an entrepreneur, if you have hired certain technicians to do certain things for you, okay, and the technicians may not give their 100%. Okay, like example, I said that okay, if you want to fight a case in the court, how would you ensure that the lawyer that you have hired, he will give 100% to fight your case, right? So the winning and losing your case depends totally on his, on how he, carry forward the task. Okay, so that is when the moral hazard comes here. Here, you are helpless. You cannot do anything what the lawyer, will do in the courtroom. Or if you have a problem, health problem, if you go to a doctor, what is the guarantee that the doctor will give you the best possible advice? It all depends on the doctor. There are doctors who can mislead you, who can increase your disease, etc., and so on and so forth, for the benefits of their own profession. So anything, all of these things are possible. So these are ex post problem, the problem that that are not easily discernible. And so that is the basically is a problem of asymmetric information, that so even if you are going to a doctor, you check many variety of informations about the doctor, isn't it? And you take even advice from, you ask different people and their experiences, and on the basis of that you take a decisions. So what you're basically trying to do is basically to eliminate all the asymmetric informations or information asymmetry, isn't it? You are, you're beforehand you are gathering all kinds of information about a doctor, and then on the basis of all the pooled possible information, you are making a decision whether to visit him or not to visit him, isn't it? And all of that you spend time basically to eliminate the problem of information asymmetry. Okay, so that is why the both ex ante and ex post, there is always these problems. Okay, and so this ex post problem, which is the moral hazard, in the sense that one is supposed to do, he is not doing, that's all. Okay, and so I'm supposed to come to class, I'm supposed to take the classes and all, and if I don't do it, then there is always a possibility of moral hazard. If I don't give 100%, or and what is required to do, then there is a moral hazard issue. So all of these are basically applies in many sectors of the economy, and so that's all basically clubbed under as asymmetric information or information asymmetry. Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now question is basically, how do you handle this kind of problems? We know that in every sector there could be a hazard problem, there could be a adverse selection problem, there could be a principalization problems. So that can cause inefficiency in the laissez-faire market equilibrium, isn't it? But there is no easy way out. It is very difficult. These are very complex. It's not that however advanced the market economy may be, or however strong laws and regulations present in the economy, these things are not easily dealt with, because they're very complex and difficult. But there are possible remedies available, especially to governments, is to simply increase the amount of relevant information generally available. So, and that every government try to do, provide as much information as possible to the consumers about doctors, about hospitals, about lawyers, about food items that we are buying, and things that we are buying online, etc., so that people have informed choices, people have chances to make informed choices, and that will basically bring the best decision on the part of the consumers. So this basically constitutes an economic efficiency justifications for government data gathering processes, such as the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Census Bureau, etc. And so these days you may have seen, of course, compared to 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we have got plenty of information about so many other things, and which was not there. So in all of these bureaus, statistical bureaus of government of India and international agencies are basically making effort to provide as much information as possible, and so that the asymmetric information problem is eliminated. So as I said, that these kind of problems you cannot eliminate completely from the economy, but the best way is basically provide as much as possible, let the consumer process all the informations and take a decisions which is best for him or her. And so now the another perspective is that the essence of market is information transmissions about relative scarcity through price signals, and that's the best thing that we could expect from the perfectly market economy, where price determines so many things. So price gives a lot of signals, and so that is why the people when they compare capitalist economy versus socialist economy, in socialist economy we don't have information about many things, and the government is totally incapable of collecting all the information, relevant information for decision making process. But as opposed to that, in perfectly competitive market economy, price signal can be a very powerful indicators of informations transmissions about the scarcity of resources in the economy, and that's typical. So Hayek, for example, argues that a central planner can never possess adequate information for carrying out optimal or even remotely intelligent planning, because they don't have full information. On the contrary, the free capitalist markets may suffer from imperfect informations, but according to this view, they beat command socialist planning in this regard, because at least they have sufficient information to take appropriate decisions. Decentralized and profit-motivated market capitalists respond to price signals to move the economy along optimally, even though the individual actors possess only limited knowledge. So ultimately, the problems of imperfect and asymmetric information remains unresolved for all the economic systems, whether it's a socialist or it's a capitalist economy. Problems are, maybe the extent is different. Maybe the extent of asymmetric information may be high in socialist economy compared to the capitalist economy, but the capitalist economy is not free from the problem of asymmetric information. Okay. The last imperfect information, the inefficiencies, the limits to efficiencies of laissez-faire equilibrium is the role of labor unions. Now, this is of course arising in market capitalist economies because of the presence of a lot of labor unions. And the labor is an input to the production, and so if labor markets are perfectly competitive and they are lacking in discriminations on characteristics irrelevant to productivity, unions may not contribute to economic efficiencies, to redistribute income to their members, and they deal with safety, job security, benefits, social functions, political lobbying for broader social outcomes. Now, here is the thing that, as far as the labor productivity is concerned, so they are basically, in a typically or perfectly competitive market environment, the labors are, non-discriminatory in that characteristics, because they're not relevant in terms of to their productivity, because whoever is having skill, so they will be fetching the best value, or they will be getting the higher wages in the market. So but in that, the union has very limited role to control. But what union can do is basically they can ensure that the laborers are having safety equipment, they have jobs security, they have social function benefits, and so they can lobby for the better hospitality, etc. So all kinds of things they can do. If they do not offset the monopolistic power of big firms doing the hiring, then they are exercising monopolistic power in supplying labor may result in inefficiency. So that's the point, that we have this monopolistic power of big firms who are hiring labor, and then you have this monopolistic power of the union who is supplying the labor, and that is where the tussle comes here. So in that sense, the role of labor unions also can cause problems, because especially hiring and firing. So if there is firing is very difficult, then the companies will be very, very hesitant to recruit more people, etc. And that is when the inefficiency comes in there. And so how do you know in terms of the role of labor unions across countries? Because there are countries whose labor are highly organized with unions, etc., especially in communist countries, and that is when they will go for strike and all kinds of things. This company basically face huge kinds of problems in those societies and economies, as opposed to the free countries where labor union presence is minimum and very negligible. So these are typical what we call limits to efficiencies of laissez-faire market equilibrium. So overall, I would basically expect that all of you have understood the typical capitalist market economy that you are discussing here, and how they promote efficiencies in terms of price signal that we saw, for having the natural equilibrium process driven by supply and demand forces, and guided by the price signal. And so that's basically in a typical free economy, and that basically leads to efficiency. But as we discussed, that the economy has all kinds of complications, especially the one that we discussed so far in terms of limits. There are 4 or 5 limits. There are strong limits are there, and so those limits pose typical problems for the market economy and its efficiency. Okay, so if you have any questions, you can ask before we go to the other segments of our theoretical discussion, that is the socialist economy. So do you have any questions so far in all of this that we discussed? We have basically discussed, first we have discussed about monopoly power, which we all know. Okay, we discussed that. Then we discussed about externalities that are basically causing market failure, cause inefficiencies, which we saw in case of pollution, in case of the innovations and other things. And then we discussed about public good, the presence of public good, and within that we have found many other types of goods, the club goods, the common pool resources. All kinds of goods are available, and they are economically valuable goods. They have, those goods are having economic value to the consumers, but the characteristics is different, and they're not pure private good, and that is why the market equilibrium become inefficient, and because of the free problem of free ride. And the free rider problem is a typical problems in all kinds of economy, whether it's a socialist or communist countries. Okay. So then we have this asymmetric information problem. The full information is not available for the consumers or for producers to take the right decisions, correct decisions. And so that is one, just typical problems. And then finally we talked about the labor unions, who are basically organized labor, and they become kind of monopolistic, uh, supplier of the labor, and and that causes inefficiency in the uh, laissez-faire economies. And so if this is clear, and if you don't have any questions, then we will move to the next segment of our discussion. Okay. So the next segment of our discussions is all about socialism. Okay. Now in this segment,
Excuse me, sir.
yeah.
So in the last point where we discussed about role of labor union,
Uh-huh.
so in that, like, I didn't understand the, like, are we looking at the negative points of it? Because if we look at the positive point, then as we also discussed in the point of like not having like proper information, then one of the reasons that like one of the things that can actually remove that is government gives a lot of information out. So if like if there are labor unions existing, then it's like telling the government ki there is this specific labor union that has this specific problem, and then we have to look more deep dive into them, like into their problem more, and then some kind of information can be given to them. So it's like one of the positive things of having labor unions. But here it's been discussed that unions not contribute to economic efficiency, so they cannot
Yeah,
understand.
that's a good question, Sachi. But the question basically, I mean, if you are looking at from the purely from the efficiency point of view, what we basically expect is that an entrepreneur, or when they buy input, any input, raw material, labor, or capital, or whatever, there should not be any kind of blockades or any kind of obstacles in that, and it should be driven by the again the market forces, supply and demand forces, isn't it? And so that freedom basically, in a typical capitalist economy, basically helps to increase efficiency. Okay. Labor supply or labor is a one of the inputs, like capital and raw materials and the other things. Okay, what they buy. Yeah, and so unlike capital or raw materials, here labor, if they are organized through the union, and the union basically decide or bargain for the higher wages, or they if they are not listened to, then they go for strike and all kinds of things. Then that becomes difficult for the entrepreneurs, or to carry forward their activities. Okay. Or if labor union go for kind of strict regulations in terms of hire and firing, for example, right? So if you hire and you cannot easily fire people, and who are not able to perform certain jobs, like the asymmetry in information asymmetry problem we discussed, that somebody, you hired somebody, a lawyer, but he's not able to fight your case, and so then you what's the options you have now? So you have to find someone else. So in a similar situations, if the companies are not allowed to have that flexibility, then they will not be hiring labor easily, isn't it? So that is when the friction comes, and that is when the inefficiency comes. So that is the problem of labor unions. But labor union, it basically gives the another kind of support, in the sense that the labor union has if the laborers are organized, so they can actually do one thing is basically, they can reduce the level of exploitations if there are any, from the industry side and so on and so forth. But then, in a typical capitalist settings where laborers are, supposed to be, labor laws are flexible and people can move easily, they can upgrade their skills and then move and, to better place, etc., which we see in basically advanced capitalist economy. So there is a little friction in the labor market, a little rigidity in the labor market. That is why in our developing countries kind of settings where labor are highly organized and there are a lot of rigidities in the labor market, and that becomes huge problems for the industries, for hiring and for firing as well. So that is the kind of rigidity that we are talking about that can bring inefficiency in the in the economy. Okay, is it clear?
Yes, so
Okay, so so we have seen in our kind of settings that labor unions basically they go for different, continuous strike, isn't it? And that becomes a huge problem for the, company to carry forward their activities. You may have recently heard about the Apple unit that is being, the iPhone is being, the unit is being put up in Tamil Nadu for producing goods and iPhone, but because of the labor strike and all, they're not, able to carry forward their work, and because of the strikes, etc., for higher wage or something else. But then all of this, cannot be like uh, a good thing for the, for the entrepreneur to face, because they have already invested huge amount of money and to putting up the settings, and then if they are not able to produce good, then all their investments are actually in jeopardy. So that's a typical problems that we see. So what we are basically saying is that these are limits to efficiencies of market economy, and these limits, uh, has to be eliminated, and they have to be minimized. If there are, rigidities there, this has to be made flexible, and so on and so forth. Okay, that is why, the economies of countries, they go for reforms every year. They talk about reforms and drastic reforms, large scale reforms, and all kinds of reforms are being pushed forward. So our next segment of our discussions, which, uh, as I said in the beginning, that we are basically talking about two pillars of our the theoretical concepts. Is one is that the pure capitalist economy, which we just discussed. The other is the socialist economy, and so here, when you talk about socialist economy, we are basically, the origin of socialist economy is the Marxism. That is where we will begin with. And am I audible now? My system is giving a little bit. Are you able to hear me?
yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So this interesting jokes, of course, old Soviet joke that very interesting. That what is the difference between capitalism and socialism? The difference is that under capitalism, man exploits man, but under socialism, it is just the opposite. And so you can see that very clearly from US to China to everywhere, what is happening, all these economies, and what exactly people are, trying to do in all of this. So in a sense, you don't see differentiate between capitalism and socialism in a very sharp way. And so then what is socialism? The second one, it is the longest road from capitalism to capitalism. Just 1 second, just hold on, 5 minutes. Okay. So, so what do you make out of this joke? Of course, these are the typical, joke. I mean, but it actually reflects that. I mean, as at the end of the, these discussions about Marxism and socialism, you'd see that this is the case. I mean, if you look at the typical socialist economy like China, you will see that everything can be bought and sold. I mean, including the human organs and everything. So everything is matter for them, of course. So it's a typical case where man exploits man, and so cheap labor produce more goods, and build things, and that's basically the typical case. But then, of course, is everything all about money? You know, that's what it's a long road from capitalism to capitalism. Okay, and so that's a the typical interesting But then we will see that what exactly the theory of Marxism and socialism, how the socialism and then communism. So there are variety of concepts within that. So the Marxism, communism, socialism, these are it's a huge literature that has emerged since the Karl Marx wrote his book Das Kapital, and then from there are a lot of reforms and reformists, and all of that we'll try to browse through that. Of course, this is a typical, it's a one semester course, but we will try to cover it in a couple of classes. And so for all of you, probably you may have some sort of idea. Have you heard about all this theory of Marxism, socialism before? Have you done Indian economy or not? Some of
Yes.
you. Yeah.
Yes, sir, we have done this a little bit in Indian economy.
Okay, little bit of it. Okay, so here we will be basically looking at theories. Okay, and so in that, basically we try to understand that from where actually this idea of socialism originated. We know that from the capitalism, etc., from Adam Smith. Even before that, these mercantilists and the Fugicrates, mercantilists in London, in England, and Fugicrates in France. So they developed this idea of market and exchange of goods, etc., from the barter system to introducing the money and paper, and now we have the digital currency, which is helping us to transact very quick and very fast, and economies are moving very rapidly. So all of that has evolved. But then, if you look at the socialists and structure their thought processes and the origin, that will basically make it more interesting that why this has come. Of course, the overall I mean the general thinking is that this socialism is basically has actually emerged out of this criticism of capitalist system, or the problems that are there in the capitalism. So that basically we will try to highlight. Just 1 second, I'll just come back. All right. So let's start with this. So what you're basically saying is that the socialism is an economic system which is characterized by state or collective ownership of the means of production, that is land and capital, isn't it? What we
So
saw
can we
in
take a
yes.
can we take a 5-minute break?
I can release you at 3:30 or so. Is it okay? Or 3:35? Huh?
That's fine, sir.
Okay. Okay. So what we basically observed when we discussed about capitalism and capitalist systems is that their ownership pattern is different, because the private ownership is basically the main focus, and so the individual were encouraged to own it, and that has that generate incentive for the people to to go ahead and produce more and own more and consume more. That was one incentive. And as opposed to that, in socialism, this is a collective ownership. That is not it's an individual ownership as opposed to capitalism. So its emergence basically reflected a long theoretical, ideological, and political development based on criticism of feudal and capitalist systems that existed prior to its modern appearance, especially the feudalistic systems during the early period of industrialization. And so this criticism originated from the religious sources favoring egalitarian income distributions and collective sharing, and evolved into a what people call secular theory of history and society in the writings of Karl Marx and his followers. Okay, so what exactly they are basically objecting to is that now, at the present time, with very few exceptions, countries that have identified themselves as socialists are attempting to move towards either intermediate or complete market capitalism. And so we have seen, especially in the Soviet Union bloc, most of these Central Asian countries basically now they are considered to be a socialist economy, but they are moving towards market capitalism that include the Chinese and other economies. And what are the sound and compelling reasons to examine the socialist economic systems and its origins? One reason is that despite the considerable efforts to change such economies, many are still substantially socialist in actual practice. And so what you're basically, if you look at capitalist economies in some of these modern advanced capitalist economies, and if you look at their state intervention and policies designed by the state, you would basically surprised to know that a lot of these economies are also very socialist in core, socialist economic system in its origin. And so the another reason is that the frustrations with efforts to move towards some form of capitalism have led to a revival of social ideologies in some of these countries. And so again, these are socialism versus capitalism. In fact, they are not sacrosanct, and there is always this moving. I mean, if the countries try to move more towards capitalism, and there are periods when the socialist ideologies suddenly emerge and then try to dominate. So again, the difficulties, of course, experienced in the market capitalist world have stimulated reconsiderations of at least limited elements of the socialist model as reformist, devices, basically to counter the adverse effect of, extreme the market capitalist systems where inequality is a byproduct, and that of course high inequality may result in the other difficult social problems or political problems as well. So to withstand that, to eliminate that problem, so socialism or socialist model is also sometimes preferred as kind of reform, or as a device of reforms. So entirely again new forms may yet emerge out of the changes sweeping the world economy in terms of moving towards the market economy. And so what we are basically trying to say here is that there are compelling reasons to examine the socialist economic systems and its origins. And so one may wonder that what motivated people to go for the socialists approach to the current economic systems. Now we have seen in advanced economies like US and a lot of these European countries, and some of these people are highly socialistic in their mindset, even though they are into the different professions, including academic as well as industries and all, but then the thinking process always the socialistic tendencies. And so what we call the liberal people, or people those who are left wing people, those who think of socialism and socialist systems should be the guiding force as to how we produce and what we produce, and how we distribute those resources, isn't it? So therefore, keeping these things in mind, we would basically try to investigate that what is the origin of socialist economic systems, and from where it emerged, and what are the different reform that has been introduced into this idea. Now, when you look at the development of socialist ideology, as I said that the core was basically was present in religious and philosophical precursors. So, for example, in the Old Testament, the prophet Amos railed against the rich, and the New Testament, the Jesus expressed sympathy for the poor. The ancient Greek philosophers, Plato, described an ideal society in his Republic, although it is included in non-socialist elements such as slavery and so on and so forth. And so in Europe, the Christianity provided fertile ground for germinating socialist ideology. And Marx, Engels, in the Communist manifestos, they note that the nothing is easier than to give Christians asceticism a socialist sting, in the sense that the socialists, this religious asceticism in Christians' world, they're all about how to improve the conditions of poor people, the role of the state, etc., and that basically makes the whole of these their writings are socialist in character. And so in fact who supports the poor people and their conditions, both in terms of basic necessary goods and also the provisions of educations and other amenities, services. And so those are basically clubbed as kind of, the socialist mindset. And so then the discovery by Columbus of naked people in America who owned no property seemed to live in a paradoxical state influenced Thomas More in 1516 to write his book called Utopia, in which he described an isolated where everyone shared, and was equal. So, which basically means in that there is no one is rich, no one is poor, so everybody has equal amount of things that they need to have for survival. And so that's again a typical case where people tend to draw inspirations where there is no ownership of our property, and that is the source of all the inequality and all the problems that people are owning, and therefore it gives incentive to own more, and those who are ability to own more, and they can accumulate more, and those who are not having ability, or they don't have, they lack resources and they lag behind. So that's basically the basic thinking process. During the Enlightenment of the 1700s, so this egalitarian impulse become secularized in French philosophy, especially by Jacques Rousseau, and that has led to the French revolutions in 1789. So this basically the egalitarian impulse that comes from the fact that everybody is born equal, and therefore everybody has the right of things that they want and they want to have. So in 96, Francois Gracchus, often identified as the founder of modern communism, led an unsuccessful revolt by the conspiracy of equals, who called for the abolition of private property and the holding in common of land. So that was again, we are talking about, the end of the 18th centuries, where the people started thinking about, the problems of private ownership of resources that germinates the inequality, and there is a need for common ownership of resources, okay, which started in the France. And then came the Utopian Socialism. The Utopian Socialism was the first movement to label itself as socialist, and it's got three founders: the Henry St. Simon, and Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen. And so three of them held diverse views. Okay, if you look at the St. Simon's views, his idea basically appeared in 1803 letters from an inhabitant of Geneva to his contemporaries. In that, he talked about constructivism, the idea that a rational order of society can be planned and constructed from scratch, from the top down. Okay, so that's why it's called constructivism. So you can actually construct a society from a top down approach, how a society should be designed and how people should be behaved and how people can be organized, and this reflects St. Simon's background in science and engineering, which basically led him to support social engineering, a rational central plan ordering society for the benefit of those least well off. Now, this is an interesting thing that, even today also we are talking about social engineering, that how we can organize society, in a systematic way in order to help uplift the poor people, or rather reorganize society in favor of poor people. Okay, so the Saint Simon was the first to actually introduce that idea because of his engineering background, and that is what he basically he thinks that society can be also organized in an engineering way through a central planning, ordering society and all. And so similarly we have this the other utopian socialists in the 1830s. Charles Fourier criticized industrializations and urbanizations and called for the creations of small communities of about 1,600 people in rural areas called um, phalansteries. Now, phalansteries basically, is a communities that the Fourier wanted to build, and he said that these are the people, this is the number of maximum people that you can put up in a place and organize in a rural settings, and he basically criticized the rampant industrializations and urbanizations, which he thinks that is not in order, and he basically argued that the mutual attractions was the driving force of the universe, and that this could be used to order productions of all relations within the phalanstery, in which all would live in harmony with each other and with nature. So that is the basically, he thinks that if you organize this, society comprising of 1,600 people, then you don't have to have any laws in that. The people will be basically living or procreating or whatever on the basis of the mutual attractions, and there could be a harmony between people and the nature, and that would be basically an ideal way of organizing society. Okay. Then, so we have seen the Saint Simon having talking about social engineering, and here he is talking about small commune, with people of 1,600 people. Then the Robert Owen. Now, he was the third utopian socialist who was basically practical utopian. Yes, no, utopian is basically the meaning of the very word is in ideal socialism, but here Robert Owen, he was not ideal. He was basically practical in his approach, who actually carried out his schemes. He basically came from a working class background, and he became very successful capitalist at a very early age. Okay. So from 1800 to 1824, within this span of 24 years, he owned and managed a successful textile company in New Lanark, Scotland, where he introduced numerous reforms, including higher wages, restrictions on child labor, and education for the workers. So these are some of these welfare schemes that he had at the time, which was basically very radical at the time, where the exploitations of labor was basically, was rampant, and it was seen everywhere, from slavery to all the kinds of things. And although his fellow capitalists scoffed at his concern for his workers, Owen made money. Okay, from 1824 to 1829, he attempted to start a utopian community in New Harmony, Indiana, and the project that he introduced at the time were failed, and so he became leader of the first national labor union in Britain, and there's the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union, and which was suppressed in 1834. And so here is basically the Robert Owen is basically a kind of practical socialists who tried to implement an experiment, but it didn't succeed. That's a different issues. So all of these basically, these are initial, attempt by some of those reformers, whether it's in idealistic way or in practical way, to try to establish a socialist way of living. And now, so in the Communist manifestos of 1848, Marx and Engels sneered at these figures, because by the time all of these people had written and have demonstrated, and created some kind of ripple in the society, that here is people who are thinking differently than the capitalist way of living. And so the Marx and Engels basically, they try to put their thoughts based on all of these writings in his Communist manifestos. And they basically snared these three figures, and they labeled them with the what they call epithet utopian. So this Marx and Engels argued that the utopian socialists just concocted ideal societies and engaged in vague moralizing, while failing to analyze historical and dynamics scientifically. And so they're basically working to change entire societies. And but in some utopian ideas crept into the work of Marx and Engels, and through them into modern socialisms and beyond, into modern societies more generally. So you can see some kind of path, dependency from the utopian socialism to Marxism, and followed and post-Marxism, in terms of what we have, the modern socialist economy. And there are a lot of linkage you can establish, you can see from the early period. Okay. And now let us look at what Marxian's worldview is all about. Okay, this is where basically the dominant thinking process of socialism. You have this, the Communist Party of Marx, India, Marxist in India, CPIM, and we have this, the what is that? The in China's this Communist Party in China, and
Chinese Communist Party.
Huh? What?
So Chinese Communist Party.
Yes, Chinese Communist Party. Yes, CCP. Yeah, absolutely. Now, so all of these are basically, has these roots in this, and that what Karl Marx tried to show scientifically, that how society operates using this, the ownership of resources, and so we will basically try to briefly understand what is the Marxian worldview all about. And so before we get into that, let us just briefly understand that about Karl Marx. So Karl Marx, he born I think in 1818 in Trier, in the German Rhineland, it's in West Germany, and of course he passed away in 1883. And so during this period, he created a huge amount of influence in the world. Even today, a lot of people are following his thought processes, and all the revolutionaries from Maoists to the Naxals, and all of them are highly influenced by this thought processes. So what is it that he tried to do it? Now before that, we look at what is his educations. I mean, from where he studied, etc. So he basically, of course, born in Trier, and he studied philosophy and jurisprudence in Berlin in the early 1840s. He became a radical journalist who participated in the uprisings of 1848 in the Rhineland, that is in the Western Germany, and he spent most of the rest of his life in in exile in London, supported financially by his collaborator, the Frederick Engel, and now who of course had this textile mill and who had sufficient resources to support Karl Marx and his revolutionary thought. So both Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, together developed the Marxian worldview in writings that has actually profoundly influenced the socialist thought today that people are talking about, writing about, and now let us try to understand what exactly he meant. So one reason for Marx's enormous influence is that his worldview constitutes a holistic system by seeking to explain virtually everything in a unified whole. Okay, so that is the the beauty of the Marx writings, that he looked at everything, the social phenomena, in a very scientific way, and so this allows it to functions as a basically quasi religion, because a lot of people think that this is very powerful, and they literally think that the Marx is actually produced something very very original, and people are converting to a kind of Marxian or Marxist, and they openly say that I am a Marxist. So that's the kind of thing that Marx has actually generated in the world. So the essence of Marx's holistic theory is his integrations of three 19th century, and so this 19th century European thoughts basically are called the German political philosophy, one, the French political sociologies, that is where all kinds of revolutions started in Europe, and that spread to many parts of the world. Then the British political economy. The British political economy, is led by David Ricardo and his subsequent scholars, and so all of that basically he combined these three strands of the 19th century's European thought, and he tried to produce something out of them, trying to explain the revolution that was taking place in France, and then he projected certain things, that the capitalism will be collapsed because of the inherent weaknesses in the capitalist systems that we will discuss how he presented. But then his projections was actually not turned out to be true, very interestingly, and so because a lot of people commentators say that because Marx pointed it out, and the capitalists become very careful, and that is when they try to make the workers as a part of their integral part of the whole capitalist systems by raising their wage and giving the protections, etc., and that's how the capitalists could survive. Otherwise the capitalist systems could have collapsed. So a lot of these views and counter views that we could see as we proceed with these thought processes. Now let us first, of course, try to look at that what are those German political philosophy, the French political sociology, and British political economy, and how all of these three he combined and then try to give a new thought processes or theory. Now let's look at the, before you got into that, we will look at the Hegelian dialectic, something which is why, the influence the writings of Marx. Now here the dominating figure of German philosophy in the first half of the 19th century was Hegel, George W.F. Hegel, the great intellectual influence which has influenced Marx's thinking process. And he basically developed the idea of the dialectic. Dialectic meaning that all phenomena in the world reflect a conflict between pairs of unified opposites, which mutually oppositions evolves over time to critical points, and where reality qualitatively changes. So it's basically a very interesting thing he said, that all the phenomena that you see is basically reflections of the conflict between two pairs of unified opposites, day and night, morning, evening, and all kinds of things, right? Black, white, and all are basically opposite phenomena, and they have some mutual oppositions always taking place, and that basically evolves over time, to a critical break points where no more oppositions could be there, and there's something qualitatively something different comes out of that. And that is basically the Hegelian dialectic starts. So these opposites were basically labeled as a kind of thesis and its antithesis. So thesis, antithesis. So at the critical break point, when thesis and antithesis go for a conflict for a long period of time, and so there is a kind of break point, gets generated. Something, and that breakpoint produces something brand new. Okay, what he calls a synthesis. So you have the thesis and then antithesis, and then from thesis and antithesis conflict, when they reach a very break point at the final level of conflict, then something new, which is synthesis, the synthesis comes, and that synthesis again generates antithesis. So that this dialectic goes on. It is a dynamic process. It's not a static. See, these things are this, the conflict between opposing forces or unitary or unified opposites continues all the time, and all the time the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis are being produced, and that's basically the essence of German philosophy by Hegel. Okay. Now this is basically the interesting thing, that how this idea of the Hegelian dialectic has influenced the Karl Marx writings. That basically we will see as we proceed. Okay. Now, what this Hegelian dialectic has basically comes up after the unified opposites, that is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and then antithesis. This continuous process basically produce what ultimate called Hegelian thesis, is the universal idea, that is God, and the antithesis is the individual person, and the synthesis is the state. So the antithesis is the individual, and thesis is God, and that thesis, antithesis, and then state is born out of that. Okay, that is synthesis. So in Hegel's particular argument, from a disunified German came the idea of an emergent, powerful, and nationalistic German state, and so that was basically the argument that Hegel was trying to make. Then such ideas basically influenced the movement for German unifications that accelerated towards its culminations under Bismarck in 1871, and that has influenced the ultranationalist Nazi movement in the 20th centuries, and leading to the Second World War and all of that. Okay. So is it all clear to all of you, or something different? This thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Is it clear?
This universal idea, the three states like thesis, antithesis, and the change, which is synthesis, final change.
Yeah.
Like, what's the God part is really confusing, like God, individual, and state.
So this, he is basically so he basically tried to see that everything is basically thesis, antithesis, that's the unified opposites, and that conflict between thesis and antithesis leads to synthesis, and then synthesis again generate antithesis. That was basically the initial theory. Okay. Then he tried to give some kind of uh, explanations for this phenomena, that what we are seeing today is that his thesis is basically nothing but the universal idea that's called God, something that is powerful and omniscient, omnipresent, etc. And the individual is basically the antithesis of that, who is not powerful, who is not omniscient, who is not omnipresent, and all of that. Okay. Then state becomes a kind of synthesis out of that, where state also has certain power structures, isn't it? State assumes all of that. So he tried to basically conceptualize this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis using this phenomena. So that's basically called Hegelian's thesis. This is called ultimate Hegelian thesis. Okay. Then how the state, individual interacts, and God comes in terms of which is supernatural or something great, powerful, and all. And this has basically helped Karl Marx to think in certain directions, and that is why he talked about superstructure, etc., which we will discuss when we come to his main philosophy or ideas, how the society should be organized, and what influences what. All of that we will discuss. Okay. For the time being, let us just when you're talking about a Hegelian dialectic, a dialectic is basically one opinion opposing another opinion, and out of that opposition something new will emerge. Okay. And that is constantly taking place all the time. Okay. And that's precisely the Hegelian dialectic is all about. Okay. And that were basically conceptualized as a kind of thing that that the Hegelians followers basically picked up. So in the 1840s, when Marx was studying in Berlin, a major split occurred among Hegelians followers. So Hegel basically declared that the real is rational and the rational is real, right? Okay, this is the statement of the Hegel, the Hegel, and the so old or right Hegelians emphasize the first part. Okay, which means that existing reality and state structures are rational and therefore should be accepted. Okay. And so the young one, who are basically left one, left linear group, Hegelians, they emphasize the second part, that is, the rational's ideals are the ultimate reality. Okay. And actual reality should be changed to conform to them if it doesn't, by revolutionary means if necessary. And so the Marx basically identified with the second part, that is, the rational is real. Okay. And the rational has to be achieved through revolutions or whatever if they are not changing or if they are not conformed. So they have established an ideal first that's rational, and they try to achieve it. And so that's basically the two groups. So we will stop here. Okay. And so we will continue these discussions in next coming classes. Okay, and from there we will basically proceed in terms of what exactly Marx, developed, what kind of ideas developed, and how it has actually influenced the thinking process all over the world. Okay.
So will we
Okay.
get the slides?
Sorry.
Will we? Would you send us the slides?
Yeah, you have you downloaded the book that I have showed you?
No, sir, I haven't.
Okay, you download that book. If you're not getting the book, then let me know. I'll supply you. Okay, you read the books, and then if there is a need, I'll consider. Okay.
Okay.
So you can yes. So if you don't have any questions, so you can leave now. We'll meet next week. Okay.